I did some things differently from most other cruisers I met during my circumnavigation from 2022 to 2025 on board Sea Change, my 1989 Pacific Seacraft 34. Here are the first 13 of 26 such differences. Number 1. I sailed solo. The vast majority of boats circumnavigating have multiple crew on board, from couples to families to large groups, like the crew on the Parlay Revival Lagoon 450. While there were several sailors I met who sailed solo much of the time, like Christoph Rechman on Tin Lizzie and Nick on Drac, they each had crew for part of their circumnavigation. The same is true for some famous sailing YouTubers who started out solo, like the Wind Hippie on Gecko, James on Tritea, and Thomas on Be Free. Apart from famed solo non-stop circumnavigator Jean Socrates on Narada, the only completely solo circumnavigators more comparable to me that I met were Barry Perrins, aka the old Sea Dog, on White Shadow, who in a recent video claims to be the first solo circumnavigating YouTuber, and his friend John Lister on Heckler of Whist, while Bill Thorne on Caramore will hopefully complete his solo circumnavigation later this year after recovering from being dismasted near Brazil in late 2025. Today there are some more solo sailing YouTubers who are attempting circumnavigations, including Jacqueline Evers on Loveworks, currently in Indonesia, Luke Hartley on Songbird, currently in Tonga, Jakob Lang on Wolf on his way across the North Atlantic, while the bumbling sailor is getting ready to go. Number 2. I received but did not transmit AIS signal. All ships are required to transmit this automatic identification system with a strong signal called Class A, and the vast majority of sailboats and other small vessels transmit AIS with a weaker signal called Class B. However, it is optional. The radio on Sea Change had died, so I bought an ICOM IC-M510 radio, which was advertised as a VHF AIS transceiver, which I naively assumed meant it would receive and transmit both VHF and AIS signals. But alas, the latter was not true. Transmitting AIS signal requires a separate unit costing about $1,000, plus constantly takes some power. So being cheap, I chose not to purchase an AIS transmitter. The major downside was that ships could not see me on AIS, upon which they rely today instead of on radar and visual identification. So when I had noticed a ship, either by checking the AIS screen periodically or through a programmed alert depending on their proximity and potential for a collision, I had to call them up on the VHF radio and arrange safe passage. I crossed many shipping routes, like here, or sometimes had to sail inside them, like here, which meant I was often woken up at night. Only one ship, however, this HMM Al Jazeera, never responded, so I had to avoid it. I much preferred when my AIS screen looked like this. The upside to not transmitting AIS was that I could visit remote places that I was not supposed to visit, some of which were highlights of my circumnavigation, without authorities being alerted to my presence. Despite this advantage, if I were to do it again, I would transmit AIS for the additional safety it offers, and hopefully less disrupted sleep, as other cruisers reported that at least some ships would proactively avoid them by enough distance to avoid triggering an alarm if they set it close enough. Number 3. I mostly avoided seasickness. Seasickness can of course be debilitating for sailors with abundant tales of crew members incapacitated for long crossings, and almost everyone suffers from it at least sometimes, but it could be particularly hazardous for a solo sailor. This was one of my two major concerns I had about setting off alone, being confident in my ability to sail, navigate, and repair things that might break. I had become quite seasick on several open ocean motorboat trips over the years, like between islands in the Seychelles or in Alaska. Fortunately, my initial few days out of Panama were in relatively calm conditions, so I got my sea legs easily. Later on, when I did anticipate a rough period, I took a 25 milligram Stugeron tablet beforehand, a strong antihistamine anti-nausea drug available over the counter in South Africa, where I had used it successfully for instances like a pelagic motorboat trip off the Cape of Good Hope. As described in my videos about my 14 roughest nights, however, I did get properly seasick twice, both times leaving Fiji in the tail end of a maramu without taking into account the sea state, and had to feed the fishes. Immediately thereafter, I took a Stugeron and was fine after that. But it was not unusual for me to feel queasy, especially in rough conditions, so I spent most of my time in the cockpit or on the house, scanning the horizon as a way to settle it down. I only spent time in the cabin standing up when cooking, and by design the stove was close to the forward-aft pivot point of the boat, which helped. Any excursions forward in the cabin made me queasy, so my only other time in the cabin was lying in my bunk, generally sleeping or at least with my eyes closed, and with my head aft and closest to the rocking pivot point of the boat. Number 4. I slept as much as I could. Sleep was my second major concern before setting off alone, and it was indeed a continuing issue throughout my circumnavigation, so much so that my blog posts each evening started with a summary of my sleep the night before, which I was sometimes teased about, until the teaser actually sailed solo for a while. My primary concern was not the one that most people sailing solo dread, which is the expectation that boats always keep a lookout, which is obviously impossible for a solo sailor. Some solo sailors claim to sleep in 20-minute spells, supposedly the time it would take for a ship traveling at 20 knots to converge from over the horizon. I ignored this requirement to keep a lookout, except, of course, in obvious congested areas. Instead, I relied on my AIS alarm to wake me if a ship came within a set distance. For the Pacific crossing, where there is essentially no shipping, that distance was 5 miles, but later I reduced it to as little as 1 mile if conditions warranted. I therefore generally slept as much and as long as I could. However, inevitably I would wake up every 2 hours or so, and unlike in a stationary bed on land, where one can usually drift back to sleep, I would be fully awake, take the opportunity to check my course and speed on my phone, then the AIS screen, pee, and often go up on deck to look around or adjust course or sails, perhaps stargaze a little or enjoy a midnight snack, and then would struggle to get back to sleep. Worse, when conditions were rough, it was so noisy below that I struggled to sleep at all until utterly exhausted, like in this clip beating upwind on the way to New Zealand. This is what it sounds like at night. I have never been able to use earplugs effectively, and in any case it is preferable to be hearing the boat somewhat, to be alerted to anything changing in the conditions. So instead, I would often drown out the amazing assortment of boat, wind, and water noises with my 18-hour Spotify playlist of rock music at full volume on a JBL speaker. Since I knew all the songs well, my brain could habituate to them without completely ignoring the boat noises. Several times, my iPhone alerted me that I had been listening to loud music for too long, presumably assuming I was using earphones. Number 5. I seldom clipped in. Sea Change came with abundant safety gear, including several full sailing harnesses with leashes and inflatable and regular life jackets. I never used any of them. The harnesses were clumsy and difficult to put on. The CO2 cartridges in the inflatable life jackets were toast, and I could not be bothered buying new ones. And the regular life jackets were uncomfortable. As shown here in my for sale pictures, the cockpit was enclosed by a cage consisting of the dodger, the lifelines, bimini supports, and the pushpit that it would have been impossible to fall out of. So I never had occasion to wear a harness or life jacket in the cockpit, let alone clip into the provided secure pad eyes flanking the engine control panel, which instead came in useful for securing my water bottles. I had jacklines set up from the ends of the traveller to the mast, and the first few times I had to go forward to drop the main completely, I wore my kitesurfing harness and clipped into the jacklines using long and short climbing slings with carabiners as leashes. I soon figured out how to drop the main and tie it down without clipping in, by flopping my body over the boom and holding on with one arm. The only other time I clipped in was hanging off the stern over the pushpit to wrestle the Pacific Wind Pilot rudder back vertical after it was pushed up by hitting something in the middle of the night in rough conditions. Number 6. I swam at sea. I know some other cruisers do this, but usually only in very calm conditions, which is also mostly when I swam, always with a long polypropylene ski tow rope with a float at the end, trailing behind sea change, like on this calm crossing in Vanuatu. I would always drop or furl the sails just in case. I would also swim around the front of the boat first to reassure myself that I was able to swim as fast as the boat was moving. Holding onto the float at the end of the tow rope, looking at sea change 100 feet away, and being gently pulled along was always special.
It's Monday the 26th, and contrary to the forecast of a couple of days ago, we have no wind, at least precious little. So I got the sails down and I'm drifting, and I put out the safety line, the tow rope, and a nice little swim. You can see it's moving through the water, so we are moving. I think through the water about a knot, or half a knot, and then with the current we're doing about 2. Anyway, it's very nice on a hot day.
But I would also hang onto my swim ladder for a simple dip and shampoo every few days, even in less than calm conditions. This is one advantage of having a swim ladder on the side of the boat, because others whose swim platform was at the stern said the vertical motion of the stern in even small swells prevented them from doing this. On one occasion north of Tonga, I was able to listen to humpback whales singing by hanging off my swim ladder. Number 7. I ate flying fish. Inevitably, on tropical coconut milk runs like I did, one finds flying fish on deck most mornings, and after a friend reminded me of how Thor Heyerdahl's crew on the Kontiki raft would eat them, I started eating them for breakfast. I got efficient at brushing the mucus off, snipping the fins and head off with scissors, gutting and scaling them. A quick fry-up, along with eggs, gave me some delicate white meat, although it had to be teased off their many tiny bones with a fork. After Ralph Bender on Z taught me how to prepare paella, one morning when I collected far too many flying fish on the side decks, I made a paella with them. Number 8. I did not have a water maker. This is not unusual for solar sailors on a budget, but today the vast majority of large and even small crude boats have a water maker. This equipment is not only expensive, but requires high energy inputs, plus they frequently break down. Sea Change had 2 large water tanks with capacity for 75 gallons total, below the V-berth and the starboard quarter berth. The lids of both leaked, and my efforts to seal them were ineffective. I did not use the forward one to avoid adding more weight to the bow, and only filled the starboard one halfway, and this water I used only for washing. but it also helped balance the boat by being opposite to the heavy battery bank in the Port Lazaret. I stored my drinking water in 5-liter plastic bottles, recovered from trash bins and filled from municipal water sources around the world, and stored under the saloon table, the leaves of which were always dropped down as I never used the table as a table. I had 2 5-gallon jugs for transporting water to the boat and kept those full on the starboard side deck, along with 2 diesel jugs and 1 petrol jug, again to partly offset the weight of the battery bank. I had multiple plans for collecting rainwater, like a sleeve on the boom, but ended up only using one, which was that the starboard water tank fill opening was on that side deck, adjacent to the scuppers, so blocking them allowed collection of all rainwater landing on the starboard side of the house and side deck, after first rinsing them. Number 9. I did not wear clothes, at least when underway, unless it was cold, like on the way to and from New Zealand and up the west coast of southern Africa. It was pleasantly warm most of the time, and I could not be bothered with clothing. There were extra advantages to this approach. First, I had very little laundry, usually done in a bucket in the cockpit. Second, I almost never wore foul weather gear, preferring to simply get wet and towel off once back in the cabin. I tried snorkeling naked once, but that drew the unwanted attention of some fish. The remote reefs and islands I often visited alone also lent themselves to clothing-optional walks. Number 10. I had almost no insurance. When I bought Sea Change, she was 30 years old and essentially uninsurable, even if I had a survey done, which would have required at a minimum new standing rigging. Plus, I had no ocean sailing experience and no official qualifications, and I was sailing solo, all anathema to insurance companies. I paid $40,000 for Sea Change and was not giving up my home for her, so could afford to self-insure, meaning that if I lost her, it would not bankrupt me. I did try to get liability-only insurance, but even that seemed impossible. All companies I approached either would not insure US-flagged boats, like Pantaenius International here, or simply said no. So I had to make sure I never hit another boat or ran ashore and became responsible for an expensive salvage. I did, however, need liability insurance for marinas in New Zealand and Australia, and eventually found a company, Pantaenius Australia, not the better-known international version above, that gave me a year's liability insurance for 500 Australian dollars, with a 10 million Australia dollar limit, which is what marinas in New Zealand and Australia asked for. Apparently, this was achieved by them listing my boat as Australian flagged. That allowed me to berth and twice leave Sea Change in marinas in both countries. There were some sailors who have no insurance, like the Wind Hippie and the Sailing Brothers, who either are fortunate to find public moorings, or locals willing to let them use a private mooring or dock, or just always anchored out. Quarantine docks do not require insurance, so those would always be available, at least temporarily, in relevant marinas. Number 11. I climbed the mast a lot, mostly because I discovered breaking wires in my standing rigging and regularly improved the resulting backup rigging, which after starting out as spare halyards and sheets, then included lifelines and mooring lines, then also tie-down ratcheting straps, and finally was all replaced with Dyneema, as shown in this image. But there were many other reasons for climbing the mast, such as twice replacing the Windex, and including once at sea to secure the tricolor mast headlamp that had broken loose and was swinging by the wire. That was not fun. But sometimes I even did it just for the view, like this. I never liked doing it, but very much appreciated having mast steps, here being re-riveted by my Namibian friend Jacob Reed before I started out in Panama. I always used a jumor or an ascender on the taut main halyard as a safety attached to my kitesurfing harness, albeit being a little awkward when descending. I met some cruisers who had never been up their mast and had essentially no way of doing it, certainly not solo, which was amazing to me. Number 12. I never ran the engine, solely to charge the batteries. Even with the efficient solar charging and lithium batteries common on boats today, one still hears and sees cruisers running their diesel engine, or alternatively a petrol generator, solely to charge their batteries, presumably because they have such high energy demands on board. With my minimal energy demands, primarily a small old Engel refrigerator below the chart table that drew only a few amps, I never had the need to do that. I had a 330-watt large, newish solar panel above the bimini that got my 4 house batteries fully charged by the end of every day, even if it was mostly cloudy. And I used one of 2 old 150-watt panels that came with the boat to keep my engine starter battery fully charged. Of course, when motoring, the alternator inevitably would also charge the batteries. I mounted the 2 original solar panels on the lifelines, where they could double as splash guards by being lowered and slid forwards in rough conditions. Number 13. I did not have a vang on the boom. Instead, I rigged a somewhat unusual preventer system with a sturdy line on each side of the boat from the aft cleat led through a big block attached to the top of the middle chain plate for the upper shroud, and then attached to the most distal of the 3 bales that held the blocks for the mid-boom main sheet. I would use it on any point of sail from reaching to dead downwind. After securing it reasonably tightly, I would then winch in the main sheet with the traveller at full extension to tighten everything against the topping lift, thus securing the boom in place. I had several inadvertent crash jibes for various reasons, and each time the boom stayed in place and only the mainsail flopped over. This system also allowed for completely controlled, planned jibes. Some critics complained that the force on the chain plate was in an inappropriate direction. However, this force was tiny compared with the purely vertical force of the rig itself, and did not worry me. Another advantage of this system over a regular preventer led from the bow to the end of the boom is that it allowed me to forego a vang, of which I was glad when 3 boats arrived at the same time as me in Nukuhiva in the Marquesas after their Pacific crossing with broken booms, all broken at the vang attachment point. In part 2, I described the last 13 differences between my sailing and that of most other cruisers.